Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and in this video I'm going to show you the photo and video quality of Canon's flagship mirrorless camera, the EOS R3. Now this is part 2 of my EOS R3 review, and I'm going to dive straight into my quality and also autofocus results. So if you're interested in an overview of the design, the controls and a deep dive into that eye control autofocus system, then do check out part 1 of my review that I've linked to here. Now, all the results I'm showing you in this video were made with a pre-production EOS R3, and Canon was happy for me to share all of them with that caveat. I plan to make an updated quality review with a final production model when they become available, but for now, the fact that Canon is happy for me to share these results suggests to me that my pre-production sample was pretty close to final quality. So let's start with the photo quality. The EOS R3 sports Canon's first full-frame, back-illuminated stacked CMOS sensor, which is a complicated way of saying it has fast output, in turn supporting quick bursts with minimal skewing when using the electronic shutter. Canon's opted for 24.1 megapixels, just like Sony's 3-year-old A9, for a balance of resolution, noise and speed. You can choose from the full 6000 by 4000 pixels or 3 lower resolutions, and for JPEGs you can set the compression level for each size in 10 increments. 14-bit RAW files are available in full or compressed CRAW versions, and there's also the option to switch between JPEG to HIF files in 10 bits if desired. Okay, so here's a photo taken with the EOS R3 and the RF 24-72.8, one of the sharpest lenses in the native catalogue. Zooming in shows a nice degree of detail, but to see a more meaningful comparison against some rival models, I'm going to turn to the resolution chart. So here's the EOS R3, again with the RF 24-72.8 at 50mm f8, and in this video I'm showing you JPEGs from a pre-production model. Once the camera and RAW converters all come out of beta, I'll make another comparison for you. So here's a closer look at the R3 chart at the top, with the R6 representing itself and the 1DX Mark III in the middle, as they share the same 20 megapixel sensor, and finally the 45 megapixel EOS R5 at the bottom. Now, as you'd expect, the R5 comfortably outresolves both the R6 and the R3 thanks to its considerably higher resolution, so if you're into the finest details or cropping small areas, that's the model to aim for. And while the R3 is visibly resolving slightly higher detail than the R6 1DX3 sensor in the middle, it's not by a particularly significant margin. The R3 does of course have other benefits like speed, but if you're into detail alone, I'd say the R3, R6 and 1DX Mark III are roughly equivalent. To evaluate noise, I photographed this bunch of flowers using the R3's full ISO range from 100 to 102,400 ISO, along with the extended options of 50 and 204,800 ISO. I'll now crop in on the outer camera JPEGs for you as a preview until I can process RAW files and make more comparisons. See you in a minute. Okay, now for autofocus. Now I wanted to start with birds, and to show the subject and eye detection in action, I recorded the HDMI output of the R3 when it was fitted with the RF 70-200 2.8. Now like the R5 and R6 before it, the R3 can easily recognize and track animals, even locking onto their eyes if they're close enough. I found it worked really well for Brighton seagulls, simply using the widest AF area and letting the technology do the rest. There's no need to use the R3's eye control system here. So here's a selection of images I shot with the R3 and RF 70-200 2.8, mostly at 200mm 2.8, and again using the wide AF area with animals selected as the subject type. Unlike Sony, Canon doesn't ask you to differentiate between birds and other animals, so that's a bit more convenient. I used the electronic shutter here in H+ mode, where it consistently delivered the top 30 frames per second frame rate, even with continuous servo AF. So I was ending up with 50% more images than the R5 at its top electronic speed, but more importantly, the faster readout of the sensor meant less rolling shutter and less skewing as I panned to follow the birds, and this is particularly noticeable as they swoop past the buildings, because those were skewing to the side on some of my R5 samples. I was also able to exploit shutter speeds up to 64,000th of a second on the R3. But of course the R3 lacks the high resolution of the R5, so there's less opportunities for making big crops. Next for cars, as the R3 now features a new vehicle subject tracking option for cars and bikes, and as luck would have it, there was a drag racing event on in Brighton as I tested the R3. For starters, here's some mostly static shots of some cars to show the vehicle detection in action. Canon also make a big deal about you being able to choose whether the camera should focus on the vehicle or the helmet of the driver, but in my test with a pre-production sample, it only found a helmet behind the windscreen once. Now there is an option for spot detection when selecting vehicle in the AF menus, but it didn't make a difference in my tests here and I'm not 100% sure what that is supposed to do yet. And now for the AF system in action with the cars starting their races. Unfortunately, race rules prevented me from being further along the track, so you're only seeing the first few seconds of each race, but you can still see the camera recognising and tracking the vehicle's shape. Again, this is something I look forward to retesting with a final production model in my next video about the R3. I'll show you some of the still photos from this event later. One of the most exciting new features of the R3 is the eye control, which lets you very accurately position the AF area or pick between multiple subjects by simply glancing at them before then pushing the shutter or AF on button to confirm. Now I've gone into detail about this in my hands-on R3 review, that's part 1, but for now I'll say it absolutely transforms subject selection in team sports and also street photography. So if you've not already seen part 1 of my review, do check that out after you finish this one. As I've mentioned, the R3 stacked CMOS sensor has faster readout and reduced skewing, so to put it to the test, here's a fast pan I made using the mechanical shutter where all the buildings are of course upright, as they should be, followed by a pan made with the electronic shutter, which looks a bit slower because it was operating at a higher frame rate. Now you can see very minor skewing on the tower, but it's still pretty well behaved. Here's another pan across the tower with a longer lens using the electronic shutter, where I'd say the skewing is roughly equivalent to the Alpha 1. Which means both the Alpha 1 and the R3 are a huge improvement over the R5 and R6 and 1DX Mark III, and it makes their electronic shutters and top burst speeds just so much more practical. I'll show you more sample images with the R3 at the end of this video, but now it's time to look at the movie mode, and do stick around even if you're mostly a still shooter because it does give really good performance. And I'm going to start with the quality options when the camera is set to PAL. I'll switch this for the NTSC options afterwards. So you can film in 1080 or 4K, and the latter in the choice of 16:9 UHD or the wider cinema DCI shape. In normal filming modes with sound, you can choose frame rates from 24 to 60p, and in the choice of IPB, IPB Lite or All-I encoding. You can also set the camera to record 12-bit RAW internally in 6K at 6000 by 3164 pixels, that's the wider DCI shape, and in frame rates from 24 to 60p. At the time I made this video, it's only recorded internally in Canon CRM or Light RAW formats, but I hope it will be available over HDMI to an Atomos recorder in the future. Surely that's got to come in a firmware update, right? Fans of slow motion will be pleased to learn the R3's high-speed video mode can record 1080 or 4K at 100p when set to PAL or 120p in NTSC, and as before you can choose 4K to be in either the 16:9 shape or the DCI shape. This footage is then slowed by 4 times automatically within the camera, and it's encoded without any sound. I'll show you a bunch of clips near the end of this video. The R3 has dual memory card slots for SD and CF Express, and I'm pleased to report you can record most of the video formats to SD. The exceptions are when filming 4K with All-I encoding between 50 and 120p, and if you're doing any of the RAW formats, because all of those demand CF Express. Choose one of the lower bitrate options though, and you can record to both cards simultaneously, and if you'd like a backup when filming RAW to the CF Express card, you can record a lower bitrate MP4 to the SD. Graders can also exploit C-Log 3, which records 10-bit 422 and can also output it over HDMI if desired. Here's a clip that I filmed in the standard profile, and now the same one in C-Log 3. I'll test the R3's dynamic range for RAW and log video and still RAW files when I have a final production sample and when the software is all updated to support it. But now for some really good news. The R3 can record for a long time and didn't suffer from overheating at all in my tests, presumably thanks to the bigger body and lessons learned from the R5. But wait, there's even more. Regular Canon owners will know that they would normally stop recording at this point, 29:59. Let's see what happens. 30 minutes. So the EOS R3 becomes the first non-cinema Canon camera interchangeable lens camera or EOS camera to actually break that 30-minute limit. And this is in 4K 25p, so let's leave it running and see how long it can go. So the Canon EOS R3 sailed comfortably past that half-hour limit that used to mark the end of all clips on non-cinema Canon cameras. And right now, as you can see, it is recorded. This single clip here is 2 hours, 9 minutes and 15 seconds and still recording. And as you can see on the screen, there is no temperature icon of doom, which of course plagues some other models in the lineup. There is, however, one flashing icon you can see here, and that is the battery life, and that looks like that is going to expire before the camera overheats, or in this case also runs out of memory. So I will let you know when this clip is finished how long it has managed to record. So once again, this clip is in 4K 25p in IPB, and I have the auto temp setting set to high. The body itself, well, it feels warm, but I wouldn't describe it as hot by any means. It's certainly a lot cooler than some Sony cameras after they've been recording 4K for 2 hours. So I'll let it run to the end of the battery and let you know how long it managed. In the end, I managed to record a single 4K 25p clip lasting 2 hours, 12 minutes and 32 seconds on a single battery charge, all without overheating, and that was in a fairly warm room. Now, as I mentioned, there is now a high temperature option, but I repeated this test and achieved the same length with or without it enabled, and again without any overheating warning. With the battery apparently being the limiting factor, I wondered how much longer I might be able to record on external power. So, with a half charged battery, I connected my MacBook Pro USB-C charger and left it running, so prepare yourself for a shock. Okay, I'm back for another clip, but this time it's rather longer. Have a look up there, 5 hours, 59 minutes and 15 seconds. And the way that I've managed to achieve this, since the battery is only good for about 2.5 hours worth of 4K at 25p, is by powering it externally using the USB-C power supply from my MacBook Pro laptop. And I started this with the battery about half full, just connected the USB-C charger, and it seemed to be happy to keep recording. Now, the camera actually quotes 6 hours worth of recording time, so let's see what happens when we actually reach the 6 hour mark. But basically the camera is not overheated. I mean, it feels fairly warm, but it's not complaining at all. Nothing's flashing, and we're approaching the 6 hour mark. I really haven't done this before. I don't know what's going to happen because it's a long test. And there it is. The recording has stopped because the max time has been reached. But that was 6 hours of 4K at 25p with no overheating issues. The only thing I had to do was power it externally over USB. Yep, 6 hours of 4K 25p in a single 287GB clip with no overheating and no hacks required. Canon has finally got it right here, and I sincerely hope all future Canon cameras also sail past the previous half-hour limit. Sadly, I suspect it won't be offered as a firmware update to existing models, but I put the request in anyway. Right, now let's actually have a look at some real-life footage, starting with 1080 at 25p, where the R5 takes the full sensor width and scales it down. Next for 4K DCI, where the R3 again starts with the full sensor width and, according to Canon, oversamples from 6K's worth of data. I'm showing the full width of the DCI clip here, so the wider shape means there's black bars at the top and bottom of your screen. And next for 4K filmed in the slightly narrower 16:9 UHD shape, which simply crops the size from the DCI version, resulting in a slightly narrower field of view. Here's a closer look at 1080 25p footage at the top and 4K DCI footage at the bottom, which both share the same frame width. You can clearly see the 4K footage out-resolving the 1080. And now I'll switch the 1080 clip at the top for 4K at 100p in the high frame rate slow motion mode, which does lack the ultimate detail of normal 4K up to 60p, but it still looks better than 1080 at any frame rate. To better see the differences, here's the resolution chart filmed by the R3 in 1080 at 25p. Taking a closer look with the R3 at the top and the R5 at the bottom, both in 1080 at 25p, shows the R5 taking a very slight lead, but they essentially look very similar here, and for real life footage I wouldn't say there's anything to tell them apart. But that's for 1080. Next for the R3 in 4K 25p, first with a full chart, and now for a close view with the R3 at the top and the R5 at the bottom filming in standard 4K, both at 25p. Now, the R5 generates standard 4K by line skipping, and the impact that this has on quality here is quite dramatic, with the R3's always oversampled 4K easily out-resolving it. Next, I'll switch to standard 4K from the R5 at the bottom to its 4K HQ mode, which oversamples from 8K's worth of data, so that's more than the R3 does. This allows the R5 to deliver a dramatic improvement in resolution, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily better than the R3. They actually look pretty similar here, and you may even slightly prefer the R3 result, but in general use, I'd be pretty confident in saying the R3's standard 4K can match the quality of the R5's 4K HQ. Now, this is great news for the R3 since all of its 4K up to 60p looks as good as this, and it can keep recording it beyond 2 hours in a single clip without overheating. Of course, the R5 does have a trump card, with its 8K seen here in the bottom half of the screen, easily out-resolving the R3 or any other camera filming in 4K, but again with short clip times and a greater risk of overheating. And finally, here's the R3 in 4K 100p, first with the full chart, and now for a closer look with the R3 at the top and the R5 at the bottom, both filming 4K 100p. Now, both cameras are resolving less in their high frame rate modes compared to their best quality 4K modes, but I'd say the R3 still enjoys slightly superior resolution here compared to the R5, and again it can maintain it for longer clips with less chance of overheating. So this is a great set of results for the R3 that becomes a surprisingly good movie camera. Next, to compare noise levels, I filmed this still life scene in 1080 and 4K resolutions using the R3. Here's the full image in 4K at 3200 ISO, and now for a closer look with the 1080 version at the top and the 4K version at the bottom, both starting at 3200 ISO and now at 6400 ISO. Next at 12800 ISO, and finally at 25600 ISO, which is the maximum sensitivity for movies. Now, I'm going to make some direct comparisons for noise and dynamic range when I have a final production model, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on that. Next, for a rolling shutter test in 4K 50p at 100mm, where even as I swing the camera back and forth, there's virtually no skewing to worry about. This is a test where the R5 and R6 and 1DX Mark III would really suffer, so it's another great result for the R3 when it comes to video. Next up, for some handheld footage to demonstrate the stabilisation in action. I filmed these clips in 4K 25p using the RF2470 f2.8L using a combination of sensor shift and optical stabilisation. The heft of the R3 also makes it fairly easy to handhold without wobbling so much. So here's the mandatory vlogging test, as I know there's at least one person out there who'll probably use it this way. First up at 24mm 2.8 with no stabilisation at all. Next, with stabilisation enabled, which like the R5 and R6 before it, means you're looking at sensor IBIS and optical stabilisation working together if your lens has it, which this one does. Next, with additional digital movie stabilisation applied, so you've now got 3 types of stabilisation all working together. And finally, with enhanced digital stabilisation on top, which incurs the usual crop, making it too tight for vlogging with a 24mm lens. So now returning to the standard IBIS with optical IS shows again how well the stabilisation can work for handheld footage. And before my final verdict, here's a few slow motion clips filmed with the R3 in 4K 100p, which is slowed by 4 times on my 25p timeline. I'll see you in just a moment. Okay, now for my final verdict, and as I share my thoughts so far, I'll show you a bunch of photos I took with the R3, and again, until RAW files are fully supported, these are all JPEGs out of camera. The EOS R3 may be aimed at a specialist audience of mainly pro sports and news photographers, but it's still hard not to be impressed with its overall prowess regardless of your background. It combines decades of ergonomic heritage with Canon at the top of its technological game, resulting in a camera that absolutely exudes confidence. The new eye control is a unique highlight that allows surprisingly quick and precise adjustments, while electronic shooting has become eminently practical with fast speeds and little to no skewing. And even the video quality is as good as the best of its 4K rivals. Canon cameras often come with caveats and gotchas, none more so than the earlier R5, but in my tests so far, the R3 has managed to avoid obvious hurdles like overheating, while finally also breaking the arbitrary half-hour clip limit of previous models. They even let you record to both cards at the same time. All stuff you'd expect, but stuff you can't take for granted, right? That said, don't forget it is a specialist tool, and most of us will be better served by the R5 at a lower cost, or the Alpha 1 at a roughly similar price. Both those cameras are better all-rounders with the flexibility of much higher resolution photos as well as 8K video. There's also the fact that a lot of what makes the R3 special in Canon's world, like a stacked full-frame sensor, 30 frames per second shooting and an accessory shoe, were all previously offered by Sony, so there's a certain amount of catch-up taking place here. But if you're a pro sports photographer, I'd say the R3 beats the 1DX Mark III to become the most desirable camera overall. Of course, some may prefer the mobility and cropping potential of the Alpha 1, and there's still Nikon Z9 to weigh up, but right now it's hard to think of a better camera for this kind of job. I'll be back with an update once the R3 becomes final and gives me a chance to properly evaluate raw files for photos and video, but I do hope that this review has given you a really good flavour of what the R3 is all about. For me, the biggest surprise was the video. It's really very good, and so much more practical being able to record those longer clips, even beyond half an hour. That's a treat for any Canon camera, right? And as always, if you found any of this video useful, please do consider giving me a like, a follow, or maybe even a coffee donation just to keep me going, because I'm feeling a bit tired now. Which only leaves me to say thanks for watching, especially if you made it to the end of both videos without skipping. If that's you, I salute you. See you next time. Bye bye.